Good evening. I'm Susan Galassi, Senior Curator, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to the Frick Collection. Margaret Iacono, Associate Research Curator, and I are co-organizers of the show Whistler as Printmaker, Highlights from the Gertrude Kozovsky Collection, which is on view in the Cabinet Gallery. This exhibition announces a promised gift to the Frick of 41 prints and 1 pastel by Whistler from the collection of Gertrude Kozovsky, who assembled it over a period of 50 years. Over time, Gertrude gave the majority of these marvelous works to her son Peter, who has generously promised them to the Frick, his mother's favorite museum. We're pleased to have both of them with us tonight for this special lecture by Dr. Margaret Mcdonald, the renowned Whistler expert and a close friend of this institution. The Frick, of course, is a home to Whistler. Henry Clay Frick bought more works by him than by any other artist. Our holdings include oil paintings, etchings, and pastels. The promised gift will bring us new subjects in Whistler's work on paper and expand the chronological range, from some of his earliest etchings to his late lithographs. This evening's talk is part of the Alex Gordon Lectures in the History of Art, an endowed series that was established in 2007 by Mr. Gordon's family in his memory. Alex Gordon was a businessman and a collector of European paintings and drawings, as well as pre-Columbian art and Russian icons. He also amassed an important library on the history of art. Each year, we bring 1 or 2 eminent art historians to the Frick through this series. It is then fitting that we welcome Dr. Margaret Mcdonald, the leading authority on Whistler's art, to celebrate this exhibition and promised gift by sharing her expertise with us. Her home base is the University of Glasgow, which has a major Whistler collection, and where she is currently Professor of Art History. As the principal author of the major catalog raisonnés of his work, she's laid the foundation for Whistler scholarship over the past 50 years. She and her collaborators published the catalogs of Whistler's oil paintings in 1980 and of his drawings and pastels in 1995. In 2011 to 12, she brought out the indispensable online catalog of Whistler's 500 etchings, a truly daunting task considering that some of the prints went through as many as 20 states. An artist herself, Dr. Mcdonald's precise and vivid descriptions of Whistler's work make us feel present at their creation. Dr. Mcdonald was also co-editor of the phenomenal online edition of Whistler's Correspondence, launched in 2002 to 3. She's published on every aspect of his work and life, from his adolescent drawings at West Point to his mother's cookbook. Margaret has originated or collaborated on major exhibitions of Whistler's work throughout the globe, and she's currently working on a show with the National Gallery of Art in Washington. At the Frick, she consulted with Edgar Munhall on his wonderful exhibition, Whistler and Montesquieu. In 2003, I had the great pleasure of co-curating Whistler Women in Fashion with her. Dr. Mcdonald has returned to the Frick many times and recently offered her expertise and guidance in connection with the promised gift of Whistler prints. We're also very happy to have with us other distinguished Whistler experts in the audience, among them Harriet Stratus, who carried out a comprehensive technical study of the Gertrude Kozovsky Whistler collection this past fall. A reception will be held in the Garden Court following the lecture, and the exhibition will remain open. So please join me in welcoming back to the podium at the Frick our great good friend, Dr. Margaret Mcdonald.
Thank you very much, Susan. 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 Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure to be here again. And I propose to find all the little gadgets they have so I know what I'm doing. Right. My lecture today is inspired by Gertrude Kosowski's generous gift to the Frick collection, the Promise Gift, which comprises a range of beautiful works of art in etching, lithography, and pastel. It extends and complements, as Susan said, the wonderful works by Whistler already in the collection, which changed my life when I first saw them 50 years ago and fell permanently in love with Mrs. Leyland. My title is based on a statement by Whistler in 1878, when he stated that a painting was an arrangement of line, form, and color. Any work of art consists of several elements, including form, that is, the overall physical nature of the artwork, and shape and color, among other things. And I propose to do this mostly by concentrating on his work in line and particularly in etching. A two-dimensional composition, like Carjat's photograph of Whistler, shows the sturdy figure of the artist lit from the side against a plain background. Is it okay? Right. Is that better? Yes. Shall I start again? So the sturdy figure of the artist, right, lit from the side against a plain background, thus creating a positive form that is set in a negative space. Likewise, in the etching, which is the title page to the French set, Whistler's first published set of etchings, the artist is a conspicuous central figure, strongly lit, fully characterized, and sharply detailed. He constitutes a positive form, while the admiring children grouped around him are flat, cartoon-like characters, defined mainly by outline. But the jagged, broken outlines are full of distinctive character and humanity. The contrast in treatment focuses attention on the artist figure. I'll go back. I'll get used to this in time. The title page acknowledges Whistler's debt to his brother-in-law, Francis Seymour Hayden, who'd recently been urging him to work direct from nature. As a result, some of these etchings were drawn on site, while others were compiled for pencil sketches, which were also made on site, and all were completed back in the studio or in our Auguste Delatre's printing house in Paris. This particular etching combined elements from several sketches, with Whistler's head actually superimposed on that of his traveling companion, Ernest Delannoy. Whistler is recognizable instantly from the American-style straw hat that completed his distinctive bohemian's appearance during student days in Paris, and which is seen in the vivid self-portrait on the right. The lines that define the figure and its surroundings in each of these self-portraits vary according to the medium, and the shading was created by various means. In the dry point, the fine horizontal lines across the background form a neat, abstract contrast to the long curved strokes and repeated outlines and lively broken lines from which Whistler constructed his figure. In the chalk self-portrait, cumulative diagonal shading is seen on both the figure and the background, so that the figure both emerges and blends with the surrounding shadows. This was probably one of the self-portraits that were drawn by flickering candlelight, and that, according to Whistler, he drew every night before going to bed. As for the painting, it's pretty difficult to judge it because it's clearly unfinished. The face was delicately modeled, and there are a few sharply defined areas around his head and the front of his jacket, but over much of the surface, the long brush strokes of thin paint were scraped down crudely with brush and palette knife and create a flat, ill-defined mass. and the hand appears to be an afterthought, stuck on and placed in an impossible position. Whistler's family were patient, I presume, convenient and sympathetic models for an impoverished artist. He was very fond of his half-sister, Deborah. Deborah was the wife of Seymour Hayden, and of his niece Annie, and this shows in his portraits. This painting, at the piano, includes pure forms in the precise geometric shapes of the interior, which set off the organic shape of the figures. The sunny harmony of the color, combined with firm, positive brushwork, enlivens the surface, and the painting has an extraordinarily personal and very human warmth. Deborah also posed for a reading by lamplight, and I've got a vastly enlarged detail of that to show you more about the technique. Here the techniques are varied. Lightly etched, closely arranged horizontal lines cross the wall behind her head. Then a series of curving lines follow the lower curve of the shadow which frames the picture, framed the figure. The shadows enriched by both curved and straight diagonal lines at left and right, and reinforced by further cross-hatching. Curiously, the chair's shadow at left is clearly outlined, which suggests that when he had drawn the essential features of Deborah herself in detail, he quickly indicated the extent of the cast shadow to be filled in later. And that lumpy shape was filled in loosely and rather cursorily with vertical and cross-hatched lines. On the other hand, the lamp base was very neatly finished and shaded with lines following the curves, like a still life. This must have been done in a separate session, probably without the sitter present. Details like her earrings, the ring on her finger, the trim on her jacket show Whistler's interest in dress and invite the viewer to look closely at what is, in fact, a very small and intimate etching, barely the size of my hand. Face, book, and hands were clearly outlined, and the face itself is very lightly textured with diagonal lines. And finally, the hair was reinforced with dry point, as was some of her clothing, so that it appears darker and glossy. I should probably briefly explain that Whistler worked on thin copper plates. They were covered with an acid-resistant surface and smoked to a shiny black. The finely pointed etching needle scratched through this surface very easily, and the drawing appeared as bright coppery lines. These were etched either in an acid bath or more usually with a drop of acid manipulated over the surface with a feather. So the depth and width of the etched lines varied a little according to the pressure of the needle and the length of immersion in acid. The plate was then cleaned. Ink was rubbed over and into the lines, and it was cleaned off, except in the lines, and the plate was printed under considerable pressure in a printing press. Corrections could be made by repeating this process, or beating out the plate and grinding it down to start again. Dry point is drawing with an etching needle directly on the copper plate. There's no etching. The lines aren't etched with acid. And it threw up a metal burr, and that caught the ink. And when printed, produced rich, soft lines like the rich areas in her hair. But these wore down pretty quickly and had to be repeatedly refreshed. The numbers in brackets, incidentally, under the titles, are those of Glasgow University Online Catalogue Raisonné, written by myself and my colleagues. So G37 is the catalogue raisonné number, and it's followed by numbers defining the state. In this case, it shows this is an impression from the definitive third and final state of 3. The etching fumette, thus, is number 12 in the catalogue raisonné, and this is an impression from the 5th and final state of 5, in which it was published by Della in Paris as part of the French set in 1858. Whistler relied heavily on working from models, and some models, like his own family, appear repeatedly in his work. Eloise, or Fumette, was his model and mistress and partner in Paris in early days. In this portrait, Fumette is lit from the right and set against a plain background, except for that very roughly crosshatched shadow at left, a scrawling mass of crosshatching. The bulky skirt is outlined but not filled in very much and provides a solid base for the figure. It resembles the portrait of Deborah Hayden a little in the detailed depiction of her dress and features. But because she looks so directly at the viewer, the portrait has an added intensity. In the sepia drawing of Fumette, which is part of the Whistler collection in the Freer Gallery of Art, Whistler likewise concentrated on her head and torso. But despite the softer effect of the chalk, there's a strong similarity between the etching and the drawing, particularly in the use of multiple outlines and a combination of rough diagonal shading and cross-hatching. Fumette also posed for Venus, an etching that, due to the prudery of Victorian critics, was criticized for its unidealized realism. Frederick Wedmore called it the nude seen by Mr. Whistler with rather common eyes for once, an animal whom sleep has overcome. It's an extraordinarily crude and vicious review, and Whistler didn't forget. And yet Whistler's approach had a distinguished source in the etchings of the greatest master of etching, Rembrandt. Whistler had seen Rembrandt's etchings in the collection of his brother-in-law, Seymour Hayden, and in the Rijksmuseum. And his enthusiasm for Rembrandt's work never faltered. When Whistler arrived in Europe to study art in 1855, he'd already traveled widely and been taught drawing, painting, and printmaking in London, St. Petersburg, Washington, and the United States Military Academy. He excelled at draftsmanship in what was otherwise a distinctly undistinguished career at West Point. At the U.S. Coastal Survey in Washington, he was not known for his regular attendance, but he did learn to etch, and this was to form the basis for his future career. He consolidated his earlier training in Paris, where the impact of contemporary French art, and particularly Courbet's realism, blended with early influences like that of Hogarth and Daumier, Rembrandt, Velázquez, and other old masters, as well as engravings from books, the illustrations to Dickens novels, for instance, and illustrated journals like Punch and Harper's. His portrayal of the squalor of life among the lower classes in the East End of London, sorry, my hand slipped. His portrayal of the squalor of life in the East End of London was objective and straightforward, containing little or no obvious total commentary. In an etching like La Marchande de Moutarde, he portrayed with objectivity, cool objectivity, the poverty of the working classes. It might be dignified poverty, but it was still poverty. In the lithograph Chelsea Rags, some 30 years later, the geometrical framework that encloses the figure enhances by sheer contrast their humanity, but the actual treatment of the subject avoids sentimentality. The little figures of the children in the front are drawn with a few expressive lines, and the second-hand clothes hung above seem imbued with the life of former owners. It's very tempting to impose a sentimental interpretation on these two prints, but I'm wary of doing so. Joanna Heffernan was Whistler's model and partner from about 1860 to 70, and his close friend and helpmate thereafter until her early death. She posed for some of his greatest paintings, including Symphony in White No. 1, The White Girl, which will form the focus of a splendid exhibition at the National Gallery in Washington in October next year. Weary is a portrait of Joe, and perhaps the finest of his dry points. Here, the dry point needle produces a sharp, soft line that's really effective in conveying the glossy, rippling spread of her hair and the silkiness of her blouse. This impression is in the Hunterian in the University of Glasgow. She's carefully posed. That gorgeous halo of hair did not just happen by accident, but she does appear relaxed, and the long lines of the skirt emphasize rest. And she could well have been tired, given the long sessions and sittings demanded by the artist. Indeed, this portrait of Joe was interpreted by one journalist as a portrait of a convalescent. La Belle Dame Endormie, the beautiful sleeping woman, is one of many drawings and prints of Whistler's wife Beatrice, drawn in 1894. In this intimate portrait, she's also presented as resting, seeming vulnerable, tired out. However, I'm inevitably going to impose on this image the knowledge that Beatrice Whistler was in fact very ill, and the first signs of the cancer that was to kill her 2 years later. This portrait shows her as the ultimately fatal illness began to take its toll. However, it's also true that Whistler, though he was a bit worried about her health, had no idea at all of the seriousness of her condition at this time. So, reverting to what we actually see, both women appear relaxed, with flowing lines suggesting rest, and the images are beautiful and moving, even if we don't know the underlying stories. There's one other point I would like to make about these prints. The Hunterian collection has benefited over the years from generous gifts, just as has the Frick. Whistler's estate came to the university through his youngest sister-in-law, Beatrice Whistler's youngest sister, Rosalind Burney Phillip, and has been augmented by subsequent gifts from relatives and collectors. The dry point Weary is a comparatively recent gift from the writer Patricia Cornwell. And similarly, though the major part of the Frick collection came from Henry Frick, this lovely lithograph of La Belle Endormie will be among the promised gifts from the Gertrude Kosowski collection to the Frick. It is generous benefactors that continue to enrich our collections, and we are very grateful to them. Here are two more portraits, this time of men. Whistler's friend Becket was a splendid romantic-looking bohemian, a sculptor whom Whistler presents in his preferred role as a cellist. I have no idea how good he was as a cellist. It's likely this portrait was drawn very fast, concentrating on the details of his face, his head. The sketchy treatment of the body and surroundings was partly concealed by really heavy inking, leaving ink tone on the copper plate when it was printed. Essentially, it's an unfinished plate, but the head is so dynamic that this overrides the confusion elsewhere, which includes traces of another etching. The much later portrait of Whistler's biographer, the journalist and etcher Joseph Pennell, was drawn in lithographic crayon on transfer paper. It would have been transferred to lithographic stone and printed in London by Whistler's favorite printers, Thomas Way and Son. In this case, printing in black on ivory Japanese paper. The greasy lithographic crayons vary in sharpness. The outlines are fairly precise. The shading is soft, with some diagonal shading crossing the boundaries defined by outlines. The total effect is a wee bit odd. The figure has a certain massive solidity that echoes the assertive self-confidence of the subject. The sites of these two prints were cheap eating places. A basic all-night cafe in Paris, where soup could be bought for 3 sous, and a working man's Thameside tavern. Several of Whistler's etchings depict the lower classes in London and Paris. Each figure in the all-night cafe appears a separate, distinctive character. The bleakness of the scene is emphasized by sparse lines on a mainly blank background wall. The figure at left, who was a cashiered officer, Henri Mata, seems a little out of place. The scene's not as straightforward as it appears at first, and for once suggests a genre scene requiring a story or some sort of explanation. On the other hand, the longshoremen, for all its slightly gawky awkwardness in the figures, particularly in the lack of finish, is grounded by the solidity of the central figure, staring right at the viewer and drawn with jerky multiple outlines. Whistler's second published set of etchings is known as the Thames set. It included the complex and very satisfying etching and dry point Limehouse. In choosing such subjects, Whistler was influenced by the writings of the journalist and writer Charles Baudelaire, who strongly encouraged artists to depict people and scenes from contemporary life. And indeed, Baudelaire admired Whistler's set of etchings when it was exhibited in Paris, describing them in 1862. I think I'm going to pass on discussing it in French and switch to my translation. A marvelous tangle of rigging, yardarms and rope, a chaos of fog, furnaces and gushing smoke, the profound and complicated poetry of a vast capital. Although Whistler was delighted to be praised at all, he commented that Baudelaire had actually not said anything specific about his etchings. Actually, I think he was probably wrong, for Baudelaire's comment could well have been inspired by this etching, which is so rich in detail and textures. A wide variety of line and etching techniques were used to describe the barges, the boats, the rigging, the workers, the pub on the corner, the warehouses in the distance, which included Curtis Gin. I've always liked the fact that there was a gin warehouse in the background. However, it's not just a marvelous tangle, but it's well organized with a geometrical framework and clear orthogonal lines emphasizing the perspective. Some of the rigging, if you look at the ships in the center, does emphasize the perspective and the vanishing point, which is towards the left at the horizon. The photograph doesn't actually show the same wharf on the Thames, but the overall composition is similar. It demonstrates that Whistler's etching was giving a truly realistic impression of the filthy, crumbling London docks. It's worth remembering that, as far as we know, Whistler did not use photographs as a basis for his work, but he was very aware of photography and was probably influenced by the cutting and framing of shapes in photographic compositions. During this period, the 1860s, Whistler worked his way up and down the Thames, etching and painting. He painted view after view of the Thames and the bridges near his house in Chelsea. Here in Battersea Reach, warm shades of brown and orange and cream paint contrast with the cool greys of sea, sky and water. The brush was used as a tool for drawing and defining the shapes. Brushfuls of thin paint were dashed and scraped and scrubbed across the canvas. It's an impressionistic sketch, very confident, masterly, convincing in form, and lovely in color. The Etching Billingsgate is a very elaborate composition, showing the complexity of masses of boats and fishermen and workers around the famous fish market. Although there are some strong, long lines, most of the intensely detailed work was drawn with careful, districtive combinations of really curved outlines, crisscross, cross-hatching, and delicate shading. This took a long time, etching, correcting, re-etching. This is the 8th of 9 states, and it's a real tour de force, a demonstration of the artist's technical skills. This approach to both technique and subject matter, however, was about to change radically. In the early 1860s, possibly as early as 1861, judging by the startling composition of the small etching of Vauxhall Bridge, Whistler had been introduced to Asian art. He began to collect Asian prints, woodcuts, paintings, screens, costumes, porcelain. In this vividly colourful oil painting, Caprice in Purple and Gold, the golden screen, from the Freer Gallery of Art, his model Joanna Hiffernan is shown draped in a fairly random selection of Asian fabrics, admiring some of the colour woodcuts from Hiroshige's 1855 set of famous places in the 60-odd provinces. The subject matter, the depiction of space, the selective use of colour and pattern, and above all, the economic and descriptive use of line had a huge impact on Whistler. But perhaps as a result, Whistler became extremely dissatisfied with his work. He was confused by the conflicting demands of Asian and Western art and of classical and contemporary movements in art. He told his closest friend, Henri Fantin-Latour, of his frustrations. And here I'll give only a partial translation of Whistler's passionate letter. What a terrible education I gave myself. That damned realism made an immediate appeal to my vanity as a painter, and mocking all tradition, cried out with all the confidence of ignorance, "Long live nature!" All you had to do was paint what was in front of you. How I wish I had been a pupil of Ingres. What a master he would have been. Color is really a vice, although it can be one of the most beautiful virtues if directed by a strong hand and well guided by its master drawing. Then the result is to be seen in all the beautiful things produced by their union. So, he added, I spend the whole day drawing from models. This tentative black and white chalk drawing is one of many in the Hunterian and is typical of the studies. It was figure drawing, I think, that particularly bothered him. And his ambitious figure compositions of classically draped women, the so-called 6 projects, Venuses and the like, these remained largely incomplete, these paintings. Did he really understand the basis of academic training in drawing? Did he really know much about Ingres' work? I have no idea. Was this just a momentary cry of anguish because things weren't working out? Feeling perhaps that there's something missing in his training. Anyway, he turned from figure compositions to painting portraits, his mother to name but a few. And on the other hand, he took up and developed a theme developed from his much earlier work, the depiction of night. This was to become the definitive hallmark of his work in the 1870s, what he was recognized for. The Nocturne showed actual places, usually the Thames in London, but also seascapes. The views obscured by darkness and fog and painted with subtle and harmonious color. Street at Saverne was one of the earliest of these. The depiction of atmospheric effects had long fascinated Whistler, and this is his first night scene, and based on a sketch done on site and worked up in the studio. It was printed on papers of different colors to obtain different effects. And here, in the Kosowski impression, it was printed on tan Japanese Gampi paper, and in an impression from the University of Michigan, it's on pale blue wove paper. And in both cases, the paper emphasizes the dramatic effect of light and dark conveyed by the heavily etched lines. Some 20 years later, and Whistler was carrying the Nocturne to extremes in his oil paintings, as Huysmans commented, "These scenes of air and water extend to infinity. They are on the extreme boundaries of painting, which in these slight canvases seem to evaporate in ethereal colored smoke." And much later, another critic, the art critic George Moore, described the Philadelphia oil perceptively as luminous blue shadow, delicately graduated, purple above and below, a shadow in the middle, a little less, and there would be nothing. But not all the nocturnes were so minimal, and some, though more site-specific, were far more controversial. In 1876, Whistler exhibited two nocturnes, Nocturne in blue and gold, The Falling Rocket, and this one, Nocturne, blue and gold, Old Battersea Bridge. The writer and critic, William Michael Rossetti, the brother of Christina and Dante Gabriel Rossetti, saw the exhibition, and he described this nocturne lyrically as moonlight on the river, which is right. In the foreground, the dark forms of the pier and parapet of the bridge break across the scene and throw it into a fairy-like distance, while from beneath the bridge, a barge drifts forward with the tide into the azure expanse of water that is starred by the golden lights reflected from the houses upon its banks. In unfortunate contrast, the art critic John Ruskin, in his polemical journal Forest Clavigera, attacked Whistler as a charlatan for flinging a pot of paint in the public face, which was both inaccurate and seriously damaging. In fact, the scene was perfectly recognizable. It was a pier of Old Battersea Bridge at low tide, though it's somewhat simplified for dramatic effect and shows the influence of Japanese compositions. And furthermore, if you look closely at it, Whistler had painted it extremely carefully, and the golden orange sparks of the fireworks are completely precise. He painted them with a lot of care and precision. So Whistler sued Ruskin for libel, and at the ensuing Whistler versus Ruskin trial in 1878, he made the statement that I quoted at the start of this talk. By using the word nocturne, I wish to indicate an artistic interest alone, divesting the picture of any outside anecdotal interest which might have been otherwise attached to it. A nocturne is an arrangement of line, form, and color first. Harmony of color, he said, was essential to painting. And by calling his paintings nocturnes, arrangements, harmonies, he directed viewers towards what he considered the appropriate aesthetic response to his works. Despite winning the case, the legal expenses and the reluctance of patrons to buy his nocturnes, plus his own lifestyle, led to Whistler's bankruptcy and to many months' exile in Venice. There he immediately and defiantly produced a series of nocturnes in oil and etching, of which this wonderful print from the Kosowski collection is one of the finest examples, a masterpiece in etching and dry point. It's a superb impression. It's the 8th of 9 states, printed in warm brown-black ink on cream-laid paper. As well as the ink lines, ink was carefully manipulated over the surface of the plate to add color and create a spacious atmospheric effect. Each print was trimmed to the plate mark and signed on a little tab at the bottom, which you can see at bottom left, with Whistler's little butterfly monogram and the word imp to show that he had printed it. Finally, this was published in the first Venice set of etchings by the Fine Arts Society in London. Actually, printing it took many years, since the actual printing process was so complex. Whistler wasn't really into mass production. He was aiming at a perfect masterpiece. Whistler worked on site, drawing directly on the copper plate. As a result, when the plate is printed, the actual view appeared in reverse. With a little bit of digital manipulation, a lot of fun I had here. Here on the left is the etching as it appears, and at right, reverse to show the view correctly. The actual view shows the church and bell tower of San Giorgio Maggiore at left, with the island of the Giudecca extending to right of it. I got a grant once to go to Venice and identified the sites. You know, twist my arm, go to Venice. Nocturne was first created in 1879 or 1880. The composition developed in various ways. The dry point lines that indicated the gondolas faded, and the gondolas therefore came and went in different states, almost as they did in real life, while the surface film of ink augmented the etched and dry point lines, creating, as you see here, a variety of atmospheric and lighting effects from misty dawn to deep night. These are from top left down, the Hunterian, the other impression of this etching in the Frick, the lower one of the Frick at left, and at far bottom right, Boston Museum of Fine Arts. Nearly all impressions, and I've located about 65, that's quite a lot, were printed by Whistler himself, and printing took ages. 10 years later, he wrote to Marcus Husch, the frustrated director of the Fine Arts Society, who was desperate to sell the rest of the Venice etchings. I believe they will come out far more beautifully than ever. I'm making of them wonderful new states. He must have had a nervous breakdown, Husch. He didn't want new states, he wanted the complete editions. In this case, Whistler gave in, and he responded to Husch's pleas and sent the final impressions of Nocturne in 1889. This lovely pastel sunset Venice, like the etched Nocturne, is a wonderful addition to the Frick collection in due course. It's a distant view taken from the far end of the Riva degli Schiavoni, looking back to the Giudecca, Santa Maria della Salute, and the Grand Canal. The paper provides a mid-tone of color, as well as having a practical benefit. The fibrous texture and grain of the paper holds the chalk or charcoal and pastel. The lines can stand up or be rubbed smooth. They can be fine, sharp, and precise, or broad in textures. The colors in this pastel are used lightly, creating the lightly glowing sky and water, while the domes of the great church loom large on the horizon. More fun with digital manipulation. The pastel this time is the right way round and the etching reversed, so we can compare Whistler's treatment of Santa Maria della Salute. The soft, broad strokes of pastel in vertical lines create a more substantial looming shape than the oft-repeated fine verticals of the etching. But in neither case are the shapes of the church, the outline of the church is not outlined. The treatment of the church is consistent with that of the other buildings and ships along the horizon, whether in etching or chalk and pastel, and thus creates a unified whole. Henry Clay Frick gave a Nocturne, the Riva Venice, to the Frick. It was once owned by the infamous gambler Richard Canfield of Providence Royal Academy, RI, and it was bought by Frick from Nerdless, New York in 1915. And now, over a century later, and it will be joined by the wonderful crepuscular pastel of Venice at sunset. The two pastels complement each other beautifully. The Nocturne, unlike the sunset, includes the Riva degli Schiavoni in the foreground with small boats at the quayside. It was exhibited and described by Whistler's friend E.W. Godwin as consisting of some dark scribble, some scattered blue and yellow dots. I like the descriptive word scribble, which perfectly describes it, the ghostly figures and the half-seen boats and the smudge that we know from other works, including Sunset Venice, is Santa Maria della Salute. In both, the colors have been gently smoothed and rubbed to a faint glow and augmented in Sunset Venice with delicate strokes of white and cream. Edward Lear was among many artists who drew the Salute and the Customs House, the Dogana, from the far end of the Riva degli Schiavoni. And Whistler knew very well that he wasn't alone in drawing what you might call tourist views of Venice. To his views of the well-known sites, however, he added two things: a fresh approach to the medium and new subjects, views of the back canals and streets and hidden corners of Venice. He boasted to a close friend, Charles Augustus Howell, "I told you I should discover something new. The work I do is lovely, and these other fellows have no distant idea of what I see with certainty." The whole thing with me will be just a continuation of my own artwork, some portions of which complete themselves in Venice. Whistler was not modest. It was rather an exaggeration, self-conscious parading of his skills, and an emphasis on the consistency of his work. I'm pretty sure he hoped that Howell would show that letter to his friends back in London. Both these works come from Frick's 1915 bequest, and indeed the little back canal, the pastel, originated from Canfield's collection as well. The doorway, a print in etching and dry point, is seen here in the 8th of 20 states. It took Whistler years to complete, and I don't think he ever actually completed it to his satisfaction. The site is a stone's throw from San Marco, but it's just off the tourist track. It shows the water gate of the Palazzo Gassoni, and its honor, the Rio de la Fava. By Whistler's time, it was already downtrodden. It was a carpenter's workshop, and you can actually see the little chairs hanging from the roof. It's still crumbling, and it's still very beautiful. It's still a very quiet corner. Whistler wrote to another friend, "I can't tell you how intoxicating this place is. You are perfectly bewildered with the entanglement of beautiful things. Great pictures stare you in the face, complete arrangements and harmonies in color and form that are ready and waiting for the one who can perceive." The little back canal, as the title indicates, shows exactly this, a back canal, the Rio di Lisola, in the sestiere of Santa Croce, drawn sparingly in black chalk and just touched up, illuminated with carefully chosen touches of color. San Biagio was just near where Whistler stayed, in the Casa Yankovic with other Americans at the far end of the waterfront from San Marco. Hasn't changed much. Though a broad quayside has been built in front of the arch that gave access to the beach and for which, at that time, fishermen launched their boats. The great arch is called the Sottobottego delle Caloni. The composition was elaborate and it required a frequent revision. And this impression is the 12th of 17 states. And it reveals Whistler's obsessive craftsmanship in perfecting certain details like the shadows and the little figures, maintaining the quality of the plate for printing. A greatly enlarged version image of Salute Dawn will also be a lovely addition to the collection here in due course. It shows just how Whistler, with 1,000 varied marks of the sharp etching needle, indicated the complex variety of buildings in the distant city. He printed it with the utmost delicacy in brown ink on cream Dutch laid paper. He liked Dutch paper, he liked old papers, leaving a very faint film of ink to suggest the spaciousness of the lagoon. His early training as a topographical draftsman was followed by many years of experience as a craftsman and printmaker. This etching shows, as do many others, the result of what Whistler might well have called the experience of a lifetime. On his return to London, Whistler was so sure of the quality of his work that he published earlier uncomplimentary comments on his work in the catalogue for his exhibition of Venice etchings. The reviews were paired with etchings that disproved them. An etching like this, for instance, was combined with the work of the writing of a critic who said, "Mr. Whistler has attempted to convey impressions by lines far too few for his purpose." Well, I won't count them, but there's certainly plenty lines conveying his purpose. Whistler's versatility and skill as a draftsman, particularly in the employment of descriptive line, is seen in his later work in other media. For instance, you can see the fine calligraphic brushstrokes describing an Amsterdam snow scene in this, his first watercolor exhibited in America. And in contrast, the rough guiding lines use as a basis for an unfinished oil study, which is in the Hunterian, and the wide range of line and shading in the Breton scene, a lithograph of Vitré, the canal. Whistler was always experimenting, and in this case, he was encouraged to experiment by the printmakers. They gave him stumps, that's little coiled pieces of paper, coils of paper, like a pencil, to rub at the lithographic crayon and soften the effects. And he was delighted with the effect. I'm delighted with the proofs, he said. They're most delicate and beautifully printed. The stump sky is, I think, charming and quite enough. There is a delightful velvety quality about them. The texture and quality of lines and the use of appropriate lines for different effects, varying in length, strength, breadth, shape, texture, was of prime importance to the artist. The aging artist was convinced and determined to convince others that his recent work was not only built on the achievements of earlier work, but excelled it. In 1889, he wrote to the Patient Fine Art Society from Amsterdam, suggesting the publication of another set of etchings. You'll see at the right there, the Square House, Amsterdam, which is a fairly rare print and is in the Hunterian. What I've already begun, he said, is a far finer quality than all that has gone before, combining a minuteness of detail, always referred to as sadness by the critics who hark back to the Thames etchings, with greater freedom and more beauty of execution than even the Venice set. This was probably good salesmanship, but it misfired, because the Fine Arts Society was still waiting for the Venice etchings. We've benefited because he didn't sell them, or not many of them. And the Hunterian boasts several of these gorgeous, elaborate, decorative impressions, which remained unsold. You can make your own judgments on the freedom and beauty of execution of Whistler's work in the prints and drawings now on exhibition along there in the Frick. I urge you to look closely, study, and enjoy these lovely works. I'm finishing with one of Whistler's last etchings, a wine cellar in Ajaccio in 1901. It harks back to those early etchings in the French set, which showed the inspiration of the work of Rembrandt, and a photograph of the artist at work in Corsica. And I've partnered it with Whistler's exquisite early etching of a wine glass from the Kosowski collection. I raise my glass, therefore, to Gertrude Kosowski, in thanks for her hospitality and admiration for her wonderful collection. Thank you very much.